5 Hidden Traits of People Who Have Suffered Too Much. Carl Jung. You can always recognize someone who's been through hell not by the way they speak, but by the silence in their eyes. They don't chase attention. They've seen too much to care. Carl Jung believed that those who've suffered the most often carry a secret kind of wisdom that the world can't understand. Today we'll uncover the 5 hidden traits of people who have suffered too much and how their pain became the doorway to transformation. Part 1. The Psychological Imprint of Deep Suffering. Over 3,000 words. When Carl Jung explored the nature of human suffering, he didn't treat it as something to be avoided or erased. He saw pain as an initiation, a gateway into the depths of the psyche. According to Jung, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. This means that pain, in its most excruciating and raw form, is not just a symptom of life's cruelty, but a process through which the unconscious becomes conscious. People who have suffered too much don't just carry memories of hardship, they embody a particular psychological structure, one that has been reshaped by fire. In Jungian psychology, suffering functions as an alchemical force. It burns away illusions, melts down the ego's defenses, and exposes what is most real within us. For those who have endured unbearable experiences, trauma, betrayal, loss, or prolonged emotional isolation, their inner world becomes layered with contradictions, sensitivity and numbness, compassion and distrust, wisdom and exhaustion. This paradoxical nature is what makes their minds so different from the average person's. These individuals often move through life quietly, almost invisibly. They observe, they feel, and they rarely react impulsively. What others see as calmness is not calmness at all. It is the residue of battles fought in silence. Jung would say that such people have confronted their shadow, the dark, repressed aspect of the psyche that most humans spend their lives denying. Through suffering, they have faced their own darkness, and in doing so, they have touched something eternal. Let's break down what this means in psychological terms. The inner landscape of the wounded psyche. When someone suffers deeply, especially over a long period of time, the psyche undergoes a form of reorganization. Jung believed that traumatic or painful experiences activate certain complexes, emotionally charged clusters of memories and associations stored in the unconscious. These complexes operate autonomously, often influencing one's emotions, choices, and relationships without conscious awareness. For example, a person who has experienced abandonment in childhood may carry an abandonment complex. This complex gets triggered whenever they sense rejection, even if the situation doesn't actually warrant it. They might withdraw, sabotage relationships, or feel sudden waves of despair. Jung saw these complexes not as weaknesses, but as living entities within the psyche, fragments of the self that seek healing and integration. In people who have suffered too much, these complexes are numerous and deeply embedded. The difference is they have learned consciously or unconsciously to coexist with them. They no longer deny their pain. Instead, they navigate it like a vast inner terrain, full of caves, echoes, and occasional light. This gives them a kind of emotional intelligence that cannot be taught. They can sense tension in a room without anyone speaking. They can read faces, tones, and silences with uncanny precision. Their sensitivity is both a gift and a burden. This is why Jung insisted that suffering could lead to individuation, the process of becoming whole. It forces a person to descend into their unconscious, confront their shadow, and eventually reconcile the parts of themselves that were once fragmented. The archetype of the wounded healer. Among Jung's most profound insights was the concept of the wounded healer. He derived it from the myth of Chiron, the centaur, who was incurably wounded yet possessed the power to heal others. Jung saw this archetype as universal. Those who have been deeply hurt develop an instinctive understanding of pain in others. Because they know what it feels like to be shattered, they become vessels of empathy. People who have suffered too much embody this archetype. Their very presence can be soothing. They often attract broken souls without intending to, because others sense something genuine and safe in them. But this comes at a cost. The wounded healer tends to neglect their own needs while attending to others. Jung warned that without self-awareness, this archetype can turn destructive. The healer becomes trapped in cycles of self-sacrifice, mistaking service for self-worth. The mature form of this archetype emerges only when the individual learns to balance empathy with boundaries. That balance is born through suffering and through the slow realization that not every pain must be carried. The shadow and its gifts. For Jung, the shadow represented all that we deny, repress, or refuse to see within ourselves, both the dark and the unrealized good. People who have suffered deeply are often forced to meet their shadow early. Life doesn't give them the luxury of ignorance. They are confronted with the cruelty of others, the fragility of love, the unpredictability of fate. And somewhere along the way, they also meet their own rage, envy, despair, and weakness. While others project their shadows outward, blaming society, their parents or enemies, the deeply wounded, are often aware of their own contradictions. This awareness gives them a depth that others find unsettling. They are not easily deceived by appearances. They see the masks people wear because they have worn them themselves. They recognize manipulation because they once used it to survive. They can read dishonesty because they've had to lie to protect their hearts. Jung considered this confrontation with the shadow essential for psychological growth. Only by accepting our own darkness can we access our full humanity. People who have suffered too much are often farther along this path than they realize. They have already descended into their own underworld, faced the monsters within, and returned changed. The dissolution of the ego suffering destabilizes the ego, the conscious identity that likes to feel in control. For most people, the ego is the center of experience. I am this, I am that. But when you lose everything, a loved one, a dream, your sense of belonging, that ego collapses. You no longer know who you are. Jung described this as an ego death, and although it's terrifying, it can also be transformative. In the ashes of ego dissolution, a new center begins to form, not the fragile I, but the deeper self. The self, in Jung's view, is the totality of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious. It is the organizing principle that guides individuation. People who have endured profound suffering often show signs of this shift. They stop chasing external validation. They speak less but mean more, and they begin to prioritize authenticity over approval. The irony is that losing everything can lead to finding the self. Jung compared it to alchemy, the nigredo stage, the blackening process where the old identity is dissolved so that something purer can emerge. The suffering person becomes an alchemist of the soul, turning pain into consciousness. The silence of those who have seen too much. One striking trait of people who have suffered too much is their silence. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they have learned that words often fail to capture reality. They have discovered that silence can be a shield, and sometimes a sanctuary. Jung himself valued silence as a form of communion with the unconscious. He believed that meaning often arises not through talking, but through inner listening. The silent person who has suffered deeply carries a gravity that others can feel. Their presence commands respect without demanding it. They have an almost monastic aura, as if they have seen through the illusions that most people still chase. This detachment is not cynicism, it's clarity. They have tasted impermanence and understood that life is both beautiful and brutal. Emotional regulation and stoic tenderness. Paradoxically, these individuals can appear stoic, even emotionally cold, but beneath the surface lies a volcano. Their control is not indifference, it's discipline born from necessity. When you've experienced enough chaos, you learn to stabilize your inner world. You learn that reacting gives away your power. Jung might say they have developed a strong persona, a socially acceptable mask to navigate the outer world. Yet, unlike those who live entirely in their persona, they are aware that it is only a mask. Their tenderness reveals itself in subtle ways, in the way they listen, in the softness of their tone, when others are in pain, in their ability to understand without judgment. They rarely show dramatic emotions because they have learned that true compassion doesn't always speak, it simply understands. Trauma as a pathway to meaning. Jung's approach to trauma was radically different from the purely clinical view. He saw trauma not merely as damage, but as a call to meaning. The psyche, when wounded, seeks compensation, a rebalancing that often leads the individual towards spirituality, art, or service. Pain forces them to search for something beyond themselves. As Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Deep suffering paradoxically pushes people toward that acceptance. For example, someone who has lost faith in humanity may begin to explore philosophy or religion in search of purpose. Another may turn to creative expression as a form of catharsis. Jung believed these compensatory movements were orchestrated by the self, the inner intelligence that drives individuation. Through them, pain becomes the raw material of transformation. This is why people who have suffered too much often possess a unique form of wisdom. They don't seek happiness in the shallow sense, they seek meaning. They understand that suffering, when endured consciously, refines the soul. The alchemy of pain, turning darkness into gold. In Jungian alchemy, every stage of transformation follows a symbolic sequence: nigredo, blackening albedo, whitening citrinitas, yellowing, and rubedo, reddening. Each stage mirrors the psychological process of facing, purifying, integrating, and illuminating the self. People who have suffered too much often live through these alchemical stages without realizing it. Nigredo, when life collapses and despair consumes everything. Albedo, when the person begins to see faint light, acknowledging their pain without judgment. Citrinitas, when wisdom dawns and the person understands that every wound carries a message. Rubedo, when suffering is transmuted into compassion, creativity, or spiritual awakening. This process cannot be rushed. It often takes years, even decades, and it demands brutal honesty. But once complete, the individual emerges radiant, not in a superficial way, but with a quiet, magnetic strength. Jung called this the union of opposites, when light and shadow coexist harmoniously within the soul. Part 2, Hidden Trait 1, Profound Empathy. Born from pain. Over 3,000 words, empathy is often romanticized as a virtue, but Carl Jung would describe it as something far more complex, an instinct that emerges from deep psychic wounds. Those who have suffered profoundly don't just feel for others, they feel with others because the landscape of pain is familiar to them. Their suffering carves pathways through their unconscious, connecting them to the collective human experience in ways that others cannot comprehend. According to Jung, every psychological wound leaves behind a complex, a cluster of emotions, memories, and symbols bound together by intense feeling. These complexes live autonomously in the psyche. They think, feel, and even act on their own. When someone who has experienced deep suffering encounters another person's pain, these complexes resonate. It's as if an inner tuning fork vibrates at the same frequency. This is the foundation of their empathy. It's not taught, it's felt. But empathy born from suffering is double-edged. It can heal or destroy depending on whether it is integrated into consciousness or left to run wild in the unconscious. The unconscious origins of empathy. Jung's theory of the unconscious proposes that beneath our waking ego lies a vast reservoir of unprocessed experiences, instincts, and ancestral memories, the collective unconscious. Within it dwell archetypes, universal patterns of human emotion and behavior. One of these is the archetype of the wounded child, a symbol of innocence violated by life's cruelty. For people who have suffered too much, this archetype becomes active early in life. When a child is exposed to neglect, humiliation, or loss, their psyche is forced to expand prematurely. They learn to read the emotional weather of their environment to survive. They detect tension in a parent's voice, the shift in someone's body language, the subtle cues of rejection or approval. Over time, this hyper-attunement becomes second nature. It's not a skill, it's a defense mechanism. Jung would call it a form of psychic compensation, where the psyche develops one function excessively to protect itself from chaos. As adults, these individuals carry that same sensitivity into relationships. They intuit what others feel before those people can articulate it. They sense hidden sadness behind a smile, suppressed anger beneath politeness. It is as if their unconscious merges with the emotional field of the other. Jung described this as participation mystique, a primitive but profound psychological connection where boundaries blur between self and other. However, when empathy operates unconsciously, it can lead to enmeshment. The individual absorbs other people's emotions as their own. They may feel drained, confused, or overwhelmed after social interactions. Their natural desire to help can become self-destructive. The trap of the wounded healer Jung used the myth of Chiron, the immortal centaur, wounded by a poisoned arrow, to illustrate a powerful archetype, the wounded healer. Chiron could not heal himself, yet he became a master healer and teacher to gods and heroes. In Jungian psychology, this myth represents the paradox of the healer. Those most capable of understanding others' pain are often carrying their own. People who have suffered too much embody this archetype. Their pain becomes a bridge of compassion. They do not fear tears, anger, or despair in others because they have already walked through those states. They become emotional anchors in relationships, workplaces, and communities. People confide in them naturally. But there is a shadow side. They may unconsciously seek to heal others as a way to heal themselves. Jung would interpret this as a projection of the inner wound onto the external world. The person keeps attracting broken individuals because their unconscious is trying to resolve unfinished inner business. In relationships, this manifests as the rescuer complex, an endless pattern of trying to fix others at the expense of one's own well-being. The key to transcending this pattern lies in awareness. The empathic person must recognize that healing cannot be outsourced. It must occur within. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." In other words, until they see the hidden motive behind their empathy, the need to redeem their own pain, they will remain trapped in the cycle of self-sacrifice. Emotional resonance and the mirror effect. Deeply wounded people have an uncanny ability to mirror the emotions of those around them. Jung described this as a form of psychic contagion that happens when two unconscious systems interact. Energy moves from one psyche to another through projection and transference. For instance, when someone angry or fearful enters the room, most people notice it but quickly detach. The empath, however, absorbs it. Their body reacts before their mind does. Their heartbeat accelerates, their mood shifts, their thoughts spiral. This is not imagination, it's the psyche's way of responding to the emotional field. From Jung's perspective, this heightened receptivity suggests a thin boundary between the ego and the unconscious. The empathic person lives closer to the depths. Their inner and outer worlds interpenetrate. But without strong ego boundaries, this openness becomes dangerous. They risk becoming possessed by the moods of others, losing their own center. The way out, Jung would say, is individuation, the process of differentiating one's self from the collective emotional field. The empath must learn to discern what is mine and what belongs to the other. This is not cold detachment, it's conscious empathy. It means maintaining compassion while remaining grounded in one's own psyche. Empathy as a bridge to the collective unconscious. People who have suffered too much often describe experiences that border on the mystical. They can feel the energy of a place or anticipate someone's emotional state before it's expressed. Jung might interpret this as access to the collective unconscious, a level of reality where all human experiences are interconnected. In moments of intense empathy, boundaries between individuals dissolve and one taps into shared psychic material. This is why trauma survivors often understand each other instantly, even without words. They recognize the same vibration of pain, the same haunted silence behind the eyes. It's not telepathy, it's resonance through the collective field. But Jung would caution, entering the collective unconscious without strong ego development can lead to inflation, the belief that one is special, chosen, or omniscient. Many empathic people fall into this trap, mistaking sensitivity for spiritual superiority. True empathy in Jungian terms is humble. It recognizes that understanding another's pain doesn't make you above them, it makes you equally human. The alchemy of emotional transmutation. In alchemical symbolism, empathy is the process of turning raw lead pain into gold understanding. When an empathic person encounters suffering, they unconsciously relive their own pain. But through consciousness, they can transform it. Imagine someone listening to a friend's heartbreak. If they react purely emotionally, they drown in sympathy. But if they listen consciously, holding space without losing center, something miraculous happens. Their presence itself becomes healing. Jung called this holding the tension of opposites, the ability to remain balanced between two polarities, in this case between self and other compassion and detachment. The empath who has suffered learns this balance over time. They realize that to truly help others, they must first maintain their own psychic integrity. The pain they once carried becomes an instrument of wisdom. They stop absorbing energy and start transmuting it. Instead of being drained, they become conduits for transformation. The role of the anima and animus. Jung's model of the psyche includes two inner figures, the anima, the inner feminine in men, and the animus, the inner masculine in women. These archetypes mediate between the conscious ego and the unconscious, often appearing in dreams or projections. For highly empathic people, these figures are often hyperactive because suffering forces early contact with the unconscious. The anima or animus becomes a guide, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce, leading them through emotional chaos. For example, a man who has suffered emotional neglect may develop a deep connection with his anima, gaining access to intuition, creativity, and sensitivity. A woman who has endured trauma may strengthen her animus, developing inner courage and discernment. But if these archetypes are not integrated, empathy becomes distorted. The man may idealize women, projecting his anima onto them and expecting them to embody healing. The woman may project her animus onto authority figures, seeking validation instead of inner strength. Conscious integration allows empathy to mature. It becomes grounded, wise, and discerning. Empathy and the shadow. Every virtue has a shadow, and empathy is no exception. Jung would insist that when empathy becomes compulsive, it hides something darker, the fear of being unloved, or the unconscious need to control through care. The empathic person might pride themselves on always helping others, but beneath that self-image may lie guilt, pride, or avoidance. Helping becomes a way to feel worthy. Jung called this phenomenon ego identification with the good. It is when the ego fuses with the idea of being morally superior, suppressing any selfish or aggressive impulses into the shadow. Over time, the suppressed shadow grows stronger. The empath begins to feel resentment, fatigue, or sudden anger without understanding why. The cure, Jung would say, is honesty. One must admit that empathy is not always pure, that sometimes we help because we can't stand to feel helpless or because we crave validation. When empathy is stripped of illusion, it becomes real, compassion, clear, humble, and free of ego. The sacred wound as initiation. In Jung's alchemical psychology, every great wound is an initiation into a new level of consciousness. Suffering opens the door to archetypal reality. It forces the individual to confront the universal themes of life, love, loss, mortality, and meaning. Those who have suffered too much often emerge with a sacred quality of empathy. They see beyond the superficial. They no longer pity others. They understand them. Their presence alone can be transformative because they have integrated pain rather than denying it. Jung might call this the beginning of selfhood, the state in which one's being radiates authenticity and compassion simultaneously. Such empathy is not sentimental, it's spiritual. It doesn't rescue, it illuminates. It sees through both joy and suffering to the essence of what is real. The journey toward conscious empathy. For people with deep wounds, empathy can either enslave or liberate. The difference lies in whether they remain unconscious of their motives or not. The path forward involves 3 stages mirroring Jung's individuation process. 1. Recognition, becoming aware of one's empathic patterns and how they originated in trauma or early conditioning. 2. Integration, acknowledging both the light and shadow of empathy, the desire to help, but also the fear of rejection and control behind it. 3. Transformation, using empathy as a tool of connection rather than self-erasure. This stage represents conscious love where one gives without losing oneself. The empath who completes this journey becomes a mirror for others' healing, not by taking their pain but by reflecting their wholeness back to them. A Jungian perspective on the gift of pain. Jung often emphasized that true wisdom does not come from books or theories but from suffering that is consciously endured. Empathy born of pain is sacred because it is rooted in experience. It cannot be faked or imitated. It carries authority not of intellect but of the soul. When someone who has suffered deeply says, "I understand," it is not a cliché, it is an invocation. It comes from a place that has seen death and rebirth, darkness and dawn. This is what Jung meant when he said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Those who have suffered too much become living testaments to that truth. Their empathy is not weakness, it is evidence of survival. Through it, the world is reminded that pain, when met with consciousness, does not destroy, it transforms. Part 3. Hidden Trait. 2. Emotional Depth and the Shadow of Isolation. There's a strange paradox within those who have suffered too much. They possess a depth of emotion so profound that it both connects them to humanity and isolates them from it. Carl Jung understood this tension intimately. He wrote that the deeper the roots of suffering sink into the soul, the greater the potential for consciousness. Emotional depth is not an aesthetic quality, it is a psychological consequence of surviving the abyss. But the same sensitivity that allows one to perceive life with such intensity also becomes the source of loneliness. People who have endured deep pain live with a heightened emotional perception. They don't merely feel sadness or joy, they experience these emotions in layers with symbolic undertones that most others overlook. To them, emotions are not fleeting moods, but messages from the unconscious. Jung would say that such individuals have been initiated into the feeling function, one of the 4 primary psychological functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition that shape consciousness. But when the feeling function becomes dominant through suffering, the world becomes both richer and heavier. These individuals carry a kind of spiritual gravity. They sense meaning everywhere. A conversation isn't just words, it's energy, rhythm, and subtext. A simple gesture from someone can open a floodgate of interpretations. They see through appearances not because they want to, but because they can't help it. The depth that others cannot reach. Jung believed that the psyche is a layered structure. Consciousness floats on the surface, but below it lie vast oceans of instinct, memory, and archetypal imagery. When people experience trauma, they often descend into those depths unwillingly. Pain becomes the force that cracks the surface of the ego and plunges them into the underworld of the psyche. In that descent, they discover what most people never face: the darkness of despair, the confusion of meaninglessness, the confrontation with mortality. But they also discover beauty and awareness of subtlety, silence, and the sacredness of existence. After such an encounter, one cannot return to the shallow waters of ordinary life unchanged. This is why deeply wounded people often feel alienated. They can no longer participate in the trivialities that once entertained them. They sense the artificiality of small talk, the emptiness of surface-level relationships. Their conversations tend to drift toward meaning, purpose, philosophy, or the spiritual dimension of life. Others might perceive them as too serious or too intense, not realizing that they are simply unable to pretend anymore. In Jungian terms, their suffering has initiated them into the symbolic life. They see meaning where others see coincidence patterns, where others see chaos lessons, where others see misfortune. Their eyes have been trained by pain to recognize the invisible architecture of the psyche. The price of awareness. With greater awareness comes greater solitude. Jung often warned that the path of individuation, the process of becoming a whole conscious self, leads one into isolation. The privilege of a lifetime, he wrote, is to become who you truly are, but he also added that this path separates you from the crowd. Those who have suffered too much often find that their inner depth distances them from ordinary companionship. They crave authenticity, but the world runs on performance. They seek connection, but most people communicate through masks. This creates a silent ache. They want to be understood, yet they fear that no one truly can. Their empathy makes them excellent listeners, but their own stories often go untold. They are the ones others confide in, but when it comes time to share their own darkness, they sense hesitation in others' eyes, a subtle discomfort. The world prefers people who are doing better, not those still walking through the fire. So they retreat into solitude, not because they despise others, but because they sense that genuine understanding is rare. Jung would interpret this as the inevitable loneliness of consciousness. The more individuated you become, the less you fit into collective norms. Most people live identified with their personas, the social masks they wear to function in society. But the person who has suffered has been stripped of these masks. They know too well that appearances are fragile, that order can collapse overnight. Once you've seen the truth behind the curtain, you cannot unsee it. Emotional depth, as an initiation into the soul. Jung defined the soul, the anima in men, the animus in women, as the bridge between the conscious ego and the deeper self. Emotional depth is the direct expression of that bridge. People who have suffered deeply are in constant dialogue with their soul. Their feelings are not random waves of emotion, but communications from the inner world. When they feel sadness, it's not simply a mood, it's a message. The unconscious speaks in emotion the way a poet speaks in metaphor. Grief might be a call to release old attachments. Anger might be the psyche's protest against self-betrayal. Love might be the mirror through which the self reveals its longing for unity. In a society obsessed with distraction and productivity, these people become outliers. They can't numb themselves easily. They can't just move on after heartbreak or loss. Their inner life demands reflection. They feel compelled to make meaning, to translate pain into insight. Jung would call this the process of psychic compensation, the psyche trying to restore balance after trauma by pushing the individual toward reflection and growth. This is why so many artists, poets, and philosophers emerge from suffering. Their creativity is not entertainment, it's alchemy. They take the raw material of despair and refine it into something beautiful, something that speaks to the collective unconscious. The weight of perception. Emotional depth comes with a heightened awareness of contradiction. Those who have suffered too much are acutely aware that beauty and tragedy coexist in every moment. They can watch a sunset and feel both wonder and sadness, wonder at its color, sadness at its impermanence. They live in what Jung called the tension of opposites, the ability to hold light and darkness simultaneously without collapsing into either. This psychological tension grants them resilience but also drains them. They perceive too much, feel too deeply, think too symbolically. In social situations, they might sense the unspoken dynamics between people, the hidden jealousy, insecurity, or longing in the room. For them, emotional energy is tangible, almost visible. Most people move through life protected by a certain emotional dullness, but those who have suffered have lost that filter. Their sensitivity exposes them to beauty others miss, but also to pain others can ignore. Jung once wrote, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." The same applies to emotional perception. You cannot experience profound joy unless you have known profound sorrow. The shadow of isolation. Emotional depth often leads to solitude, not as punishment, but as a natural consequence. When your inner world is vast, you require silence to hear it. But society misinterprets solitude as loneliness. People who have suffered too much are often told they are too withdrawn, too private, or too intense. Yet in truth, they are cultivating inner dialogue. Jung saw solitude as essential to individuation. He compared it to the alchemical vessel, the sealed container where transformation occurs. Without isolation, the psyche cannot integrate its opposites. The person remains fragmented, distracted by the noise of the external world. However, there's a thin line between solitude and alienation. When emotional depth isn't balanced by connection, isolation becomes existential. The individual begins to feel detached from humanity itself. They may question their purpose, their identity, even their sanity. Jung referred to this as the night sea journey, the stage where the soul drifts in darkness, uncertain whether it will ever reach shore. Many people give up at this stage. They seek refuge in distraction, addiction, or superficial relationships. But those who persevere emerge with a profound sense of autonomy. They learn that solitude is not emptiness, it's space for the self to breathe. They become whole not because others validate them, but because they have befriended their own depths. Sensitivity as a spiritual discipline. In Jung's framework, what most people call sensitivity is actually a heightened capacity for symbolic perception. The sensitive person doesn't just see the outer event, they perceive its inner meaning. This can be overwhelming at first. The world feels too loud, too bright, too cruel. But as consciousness expands, sensitivity becomes a spiritual discipline. People who have suffered too much learn to protect their sensitivity not by hardening it, but by grounding it. They develop rituals, writing prayer, meditation, or time in nature that help them transmute feeling into understanding. Their emotional depth becomes a compass for truth. They can detect inauthenticity instinctively because they have learned often through betrayal how costly falsehood can be. This capacity for discernment is what Jung would call the wisdom of the heart. It's not logical analysis, it's intuitive knowing born from direct contact with life's opposites. When a deeply feeling person gives advice, it doesn't come from intellect, it comes from lived experience, from wounds turned into insight. The language of the unconscious. Jung believed that emotions are the primary language of the unconscious. Dreams, fantasies, and intuitions are all emotional communications from the deeper layers of the psyche. Those who have suffered too much become fluent in this language. Their pain has trained them to interpret subtle signals. For instance, they might feel sudden sadness when entering a certain place, not realizing that the psyche is responding to an old memory stored there. They might have recurring dreams filled with symbols of water, descent, or fire, archetypal images of transformation. Because they are attuned to the inner world, they notice synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that connect their inner experience with outer events. To them, life is no longer random. Every encounter, every loss, every silence carries symbolic weight. This doesn't make them superstitious, it makes them conscious. Jung would say they are living in relationship with the self, the deeper organizing principle of the psyche. But this awareness also isolates them from the collective. When others laugh at coincidences, they see divine orchestration. When others complain about suffering, they speak of purification. When others chase pleasure, they seek integration. Their orientation toward life has shifted from external success to inner truth, and that can be difficult for society to accept. The need for meaningful connection. Despite their independence, people with emotional depth crave authentic connection. They long for relationships where vulnerability is safe, where silence is shared, and where words are not required to be understood. Yet these relationships are rare. Because they perceive so much, they easily detect insincerity. They can tell when someone's affection is conditional or when their interest is transactional. As a result, they withdraw before they can be disappointed. They would rather be alone than surrounded by falsehood. Jung might describe this as the old soul phenomenon, the individual whose consciousness has matured beyond their social environment. They are not elitist. They simply inhabit a deeper psychic reality. They yearn for others who speak the same emotional language, who understand that love is not possession but mutual recognition of souls. When such connection happens, it feels transcendent. Two wounded but conscious people meeting each other create a field of healing. The pain of one resonates with the pain of the other, but instead of amplifying it, they transform it into compassion. Jung would call this conjunctio, the sacred union of opposites, an alchemical merging that heals both. The strength hidden in vulnerability. To the modern world, emotional depth looks like fragility, but Jung would argue the opposite. It is power disguised as tenderness. Vulnerability requires immense courage, especially in a culture that glorifies emotional numbness. Those who can feel deeply and still remain open have achieved what many cannot: the integration of strength and softness. Their tears are not weakness, they are proof of sensitivity preserved through suffering. Their introspection is not overthinking, it is the mind's way of mapping the soul. Their solitude is not avoidance, it is communion with the self. This form of inner strength is often misunderstood because it's quiet. It doesn't shout or dominate. It endures, observes, forgives, and rebuilds. Jung saw this as the emergence of the self, the archetype of wholeness that integrates all opposites. The person who has reached this stage no longer fears their emotions, they trust them as guides. Emotional depth and the collective unconscious. The emotionally deep individual serves an important function in the collective psyche. Jung believed that humanity evolves through individuals who embody new levels of consciousness. When one person integrates their suffering and transforms it into wisdom, they contribute to the healing of the collective. In this sense, people who have suffered too much are carriers of collective emotion. They feel not only their own pain, but also the pain of generations, the inherited grief of families, cultures, and ancestors. Their depression or anxiety might not be purely personal. It might be archetypal, representing humanity's collective shadow. Jung wrote that every transformation demands as its precondition the ending of a world, the collapse of an old philosophy of life. Those who suffer deeply often live through that collapse on behalf of the collective. Their inner transformation mirrors the collective's slow evolution. When they find healing, they become unconscious healers for others simply through their presence. The return from isolation. Eventually, if the individual continues to integrate their emotional depth, the isolation begins to soften. They realize that they are not meant to stay in the cave forever. Solitude was necessary for transformation, but now their insights must re-enter the world. Jung likened this to the alchemical stage of rubedo, the reddening when the newly integrated self returns to life radiant with purpose. At this point, their relationships change. They no longer need others to fill their emptiness because they have made peace with it. They no longer fear rejection because they understand that loneliness is part of the human condition. Their emotional depth becomes a bridge rather than a barrier. They may become mentors, therapists, artists, or simply quiet presences that bring calm wherever they go. The same sensitivity that once isolated them now allows them to connect authentically. The shadow of isolation transforms into the light of presence. People who have suffered too much live with an emotional vocabulary the world has forgotten. Their depth may isolate them, but it also elevates them. They see through illusions, love without possession, and understand without words. Jung would say they have found meaning in the wound consciousness, in the chaos, and the soul in the silence. Part 4. Hidden Traits. 3. 5. Resilience, Wisdom, and Spiritual Awakening. Hidden Trait. 3. Silent resilience, the strength that refuses to announce itself. There is a quiet form of strength that emerges only after the psyche has been shattered and rebuilt. Carl Jung called this process psychic death and rebirth. Those who have suffered too much do not return to life the same way they entered it. They carry a stillness that others mistake for indifference, but within that silence lives an unshakable resilience, a power forged in the tension between destruction and endurance. Resilience from the Jungian point of view is not the ego's stubborn refusal to feel pain, it is the soul's ability to contain it. Jung used the term holding the tension of opposites to describe how the psyche grows stronger by integrating contradiction rather than fleeing from it. The person who has known despair learns to live between extremes, hope and hopelessness, chaos and order, fear and courage. Through this ongoing tension, they develop psychological elasticity. This form of resilience is invisible. It does not roar, it breathes. It manifests in the way a person continues to love despite betrayal, to trust, despite disappointment, to rise without the need for applause. Jung believed that endurance becomes sacred when it is conscious, when one suffers without becoming bitter. To carry pain with awareness is to transform it into meaning, and meaning is the essence of true resilience. Those who have suffered too much rarely dramatize their strength. They no longer need to. Having been stripped of illusions, they understand that survival itself is a quiet triumph. Their silence is not emptiness, but composure, the still point that remains after everything external has collapsed. Jung saw this inner equilibrium as a sign of individuation. The ego has surrendered its need for control, and the self, the deeper organizing principle, has taken the lead. Such individuals are not unfeeling. They are self-regulated. They have learned, often painfully, that emotions lose their destructive power when observed rather than acted out. They no longer resist suffering. They allow it to pass through them like a storm. The unconscious, once chaotic, becomes a well of intuition. Their pain becomes energy that fuels discernment. Resilience in Jung's analytical psychology is alchemical. The nigredo, or blackening stage, symbolizes psychological breakdown, the moment when life loses coherence. Yet this disintegration is necessary for transformation. When a person survives this darkness without surrendering to despair, the psyche reorganizes itself at a higher level of complexity. What once shattered now supports. This is not recovery, it is metamorphosis. You can see this in their demeanor. They are calm in crises, not because they lack fear, but because fear has become familiar. They no longer mistake instability for annihilation. They trust that whatever collapses will eventually reveal something essential. Jung wrote that what you resist persists. What you accept transforms. Resilient people embody that principle. They have ceased to resist the process of becoming. Their resilience also manifests in compassion. Having endured their own darkness, they refuse to judge others for theirs. They know how long it takes to climb out of the abyss. They understand that healing is not linear, that progress often disguises itself as relapse. Their presence stabilizes those around them. Without speaking, they communicate, "I've been there, and I know you'll make it." This is the essence of silent resilience, an energy that neither boasts nor preaches, but radiates steadiness. Jung would say they have integrated their shadow. They are no longer fragmented between light and dark, victim and survivor, strength and vulnerability. They have become whole, and wholeness is the ultimate form of endurance. Hidden trait 4. Existential wisdom, seeing through the veil of life. From deep suffering comes a kind of wisdom that cannot be taught. It's not intellectual, it's existential. Jung described this as the wisdom of the unconscious, the knowledge that arises when one has experienced the symbolic death of the ego. Those who have suffered too much begin to see through life as though it were transparent. They recognize the impermanence of everything, relationships, possessions, even identities. This awareness doesn't make them cynical. It makes them lucid. They no longer expect the world to be fair or people to be consistent. Instead, they accept life as a paradoxical dance between creation and destruction. Jung saw this acceptance as a mark of maturity, the capacity to live with ambiguity without despair. Existential wisdom is not found in books or doctrines. It is written in the scars of the soul. Each wound becomes a text that teaches humility, each loss a symbol that reveals the structure of human attachment. Over time, the person who has suffered begins to perceive patterns that others overlook, how pain repeats itself, until it is understood how people project their shadows onto others, how love transforms when stripped of idealization. This capacity to perceive pattern, what Jung called amplification, is the foundation of symbolic thinking. It allows a person to interpret their experiences as part of a larger myth, rather than random suffering. For example, the betrayal of a friend may be experienced not as a personal failure, but as an archetypal initiation the moment the psyche forces you to discern truth from illusion. Wisdom in Jungian terms is not detachment from life, but deeper participation in it. The wise person no longer seeks to escape pain. They seek to understand what pain reveals about the soul. They realize that every emotional storm exposes a hidden complex, every disappointment unveils a dependency, and every heartbreak pushes them closer to authenticity. Because of this, they often appear stoic or mysterious. Their calm unsettles people who mistake wisdom for apathy. But this calm is not numbness, it is clarity born from repetition. After you have watched the same human dramas unfold 100 times, you stop reacting and start perceiving. Jung compared this psychological distance to the standpoint of the self observing the ego. From the self's perspective, suffering is not meaningless, it is a necessary friction for consciousness to evolve. The person who has suffered too much begins to live from this higher vantage point. They see their own life as a symbolic narrative, their struggles as stages of individuation. Existential wisdom also grants freedom from projection. Jung explained that much of human misery arises when we project our unconscious contents onto others, expecting them to carry our unlived emotions, our repressed desires, our unacknowledged fears. Those who have suffered learn through disappointment to withdraw their projections. They stop expecting others to save them or complete them. They accept responsibility for their own psychic life. This withdrawal of projection is a critical moment in individuation. Jung described it as the return of the libido to the self. The energy once invested in idealizing others becomes available for inner growth. This is why people who have endured profound suffering often become wise beyond their years. They no longer chase illusions. They have seen through them. With this wisdom comes humility. They no longer need to prove themselves or dominate discussions. They listen more than they speak. Their words carry weight because they emerge from reflection, not impulse. They value truth over comfort and depth over speed. Their sense of time also changes. Having experienced moments when life stood still during grief, trauma, or despair, they learn that the psyche moves at its own rhythm. They no longer rush healing or force closure. They respect the organic process of becoming, trusting that meaning unfolds in its own season. Existential wisdom makes them simultaneously detached and deeply connected. Detached from illusions, connected to essence. They love differently, less possessively, more consciously. They live differently, less reactively, more symbolically. Jung would say they have glimpsed the self, and once the self is known, the ego can no longer dominate. Hidden trait 5. Spiritual sensitivity, awakening through the depths. The final hidden trait of those who have suffered too much is an unmistakable sensitivity to the spiritual dimension of life. Jung often emphasized that psychological transformation and spiritual awakening are not separate phenomena. They are the same process viewed from different angles. When the ego collapses under the weight of suffering, what emerges from the ruins is not emptiness, but awareness. Suffering, when faced consciously, becomes a portal to the numinous. Jung defined the numinous as an encounter with the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the simultaneous terror and fascination of the divine. People who have endured profound pain often report such encounters, a sudden sense of meaning in the midst of despair, a feeling of being guided, a synchronicity that defies logic. These are not fantasies. They are expressions of the psyche's self-regulating nature. The unconscious compensates for despair by revealing glimpses of transcendence. In the darkest hour, a dream, a symbol, or a seemingly random event can restore faith. Jung saw this as evidence that the psyche contains a spiritual intelligence, an archetype of wholeness he called the self. Those who suffer deeply come into direct contact with this archetype. Their suffering strips away superficial belief and replaces it with direct experience. They no longer speak of God as an idea, but as a felt presence, not necessarily religious, but existential. They recognize patterns of guidance in hindsight, how loss redirected them, how loneliness deepened them, how endings prepared them for new beginnings. This insight doesn't make them saintly, it makes them authentic. Their spirituality is embodied, grounded in the earth, yet open to the sky. This spiritual sensitivity often brings peace but also distance. They perceive energies and meanings others dismiss. They might sense the emotional vibration of a place, feel when someone is lying, or experience intuitive knowing that defies rational explanation. Jung would interpret this as the activation of the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to reconcile opposites through higher awareness. However, Jung also warned that such awakenings can be dangerous if the ego identifies with them. The individual may believe they have become enlightened, mistaking partial illumination for total liberation. True spirituality in Jung's sense always humbles. It does not inflate, it integrates. The authentic mystic returns from transcendence with both feet on the ground. For those who have suffered too much, spirituality is not an escape from pain, but a dialogue with it. Their prayers are not petitions but conversations with their own depths. Their faith is not built on certainty but on surrender. They do not seek light to avoid darkness, they seek it to understand it. This integration of light and dark, what Jung called the conjunctio oppositorum, marks the highest stage of individuation. The individual realizes that good and evil, joy and sorrow, life and death are not opposites but complements within the totality of the psyche. Spiritual sensitivity, therefore, is not naivety, it is vision. It sees unity where others see fragmentation. These individuals often experience what Jung described as synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that reveal an underlying order to existence. A book arrives at the right moment, a stranger speaks, a needed truth, a dream predicts an event. For the suffering mind, these moments feel like whispers from the self. You are not lost, you are being guided. Over time, this sensitivity cultivates trust, not in external stability but in inner guidance. They no longer panic when plans collapse. They listen. They no longer curse pain. They inquire. They become philosophers of experience, finding meaning in the smallest occurrences. Their spirituality is not practiced, it is lived. Jung might say they have awakened the archetype of the wise old man or great mother, symbols of inner guidance that appear when the conscious ego learns to bow before the mystery of life. These archetypes remind the individual that wisdom is not invented by the mind. It emerges from surrender to the unconscious. Spiritual awakening through suffering also redefines love. The individual begins to perceive love not as an emotion but as an ontological state, the natural radiance of the self when it is no longer defended. They love without needing to possess, forgive without forgetting, give without expectation. Their compassion is not sentimental but structural, woven into their being. This transformation is irreversible. Once consciousness expands to include the spiritual dimension, ordinary perception feels incomplete. They walk through the same world as others, but experience it differently. Every encounter, every silence, every shadow carries significance. They no longer ask, "Why did this happen to me?" but "What is this trying to teach me?" In Jungian terms, they have achieved psycho-spiritual integration, the alignment of the personal unconscious with the transpersonal self. Their life becomes an expression of symbolic meaning rather than personal desire. They are not saints. They are whole human beings, aware of their flaws, yet guided by something larger than themselves. Across these final three traits, silent resilience, existential wisdom, and spiritual sensitivity, the same pattern repeats: descent, endurance, and transformation. Those who have suffered too much have unknowingly completed the alchemical cycle. They have turned pain into gold, ignorance into insight, isolation into communion. Jung would call them those who have become conscious of the soul. Their suffering was never meaningless. It was the crucible of becoming. And though the world may not recognize their depth, their existence itself is proof that the human spirit can endure, evolve, and awaken silently, wisely, and profoundly. Suffering changes you not into someone weaker, but into someone deeper. Carl Jung said that there's no awakening without pain, because only through the cracks does the light of the soul enter. If you've carried heavy pain and still find the strength to love, you are not broken, you are reborn. Remember, what wounded you yesterday shaped your wisdom today, and that, Jung would say, is the beginning of true consciousness.